All right, let's go right to our Bible. We're looking at Acts 2, verses 1 through 13. If you don't have a Bible, we want to mail you one, or you can find the text right on the screen in front of you. Again, it is Pentecost Sunday. It is the beginning of the Christian church. And the book, Acts 2, begins this way. When the day of Pentecost came. Pentecost is a Hebrew tradition, by the way, Shavuot, to our Jewish and people of Hebrew cultural descent. Shavuot, as you may know, is a pilgrimage festival, and in about the 33 AD, the streets of Jerusalem were filled with people on Shavuot, and the disciples were in the, well, see it in a moment, the upstairs room. When the day of Pentecost came, now we don't to this day know exactly who was there. Was just the 12? Is this just the 12 minus Judas plus Matthias? Was it 24, 36, 72? We will never know who was in that place. But it was a gathering of people on Shavuot. They were there in the upper room. Now, this is the same place that Jesus had had his Passover festival with the disciples about 54 days before. And these disciples had been literally sheltering in place for 50-ish days. They had been hanging out in this upstairs room. They rented it maybe for a 3-month period. They've been hanging out, and you know what it feels like to shelter in place. Only these disciples did not have Netflix or Amazon Prime. They had nothing to watch, and they had nothing to read. There were no scrolls, there were no books, and so the only thing they could do was to go inwards, to pray, to contemplate, to think about the deeper truths of their faith. So they're in one place. Now, after this 50-day period, suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came and rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now, most likely what's happening here is the disciples are utterly freaked out, and they are giving what are often known as sinner's prayer or foxhole prayers. You know, the prayers that people who are in a war zone, who are about to go into the battlefield, begin with, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. If you come from a Catholic tradition, Our Mother Mary of God, please be with me as I go into this place. This would be like the pilot on a plane who tells an entire plane full of people we are making an emergency landing, and the entire plane starts to go, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, please, 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 God. That's what's happening here. Now, as the disciples finished these prayers, the text says that there were people in Jerusalem from every nation under heaven. Every nation under heaven. And all of the people mentioned in this text were what you and I would describe as being people of color. If we were to meet them on the streets here in Burlingame, or if you're in Paso Robles or in Sacramento, if you were to meet them on the streets where you are, these would be people you would describe as people of color. And it's important on this Pentecost Sunday to say that that is where the church began. But I want to say a special word to our Mandarin and Taiwanese congregation right now. You are a very special congregation. And you may have thought that your church started 40 years ago in this building. But that isn't true. I want to introduce you to this list that is offered here by Luke in the book of Acts. It lists off these people groups: Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, and Asia. Now, most biblical scholars think what this is referring to is known as Asia Minor, or what we would think of as modern-day Turkey. However, there has been a trough of thinking lately about the connections between the Far East and the Middle East about the 1st century AD. Let me show you a map of the Silk Road that was leading from Peking, eastern China, to Damascus in the year 200 BC. And as you can see, the Silk Road leads through China, Tibet, India, Siam, Korea, and all the way to the Holy Land. It is likely that some of the people in the streets came from what we would know today as modern Asia. And so what I want to say to our Mandarin and Taiwanese congregation is, you think that your church began 40 years ago. It did not. It began 2,000 years ago in the streets of Jerusalem, and that you come from a great and rich theological tradition. But let's move back to our text. So the disciples come out and they connect with people of all these different nations in the streets. And that is where the church begins. Now, we don't have a lot of time to explore this entire text today, and so I just want to focus on the first part. And the first part is about the disciples going inwards, going inside in prayer before the church begins. And what I want to suggest to you today is that all great movements in history always begin in contemplation and in prayer. And we don't have the time to get into it today, but the Reformation with Luther begins in contemplation and in prayer. The Constitutional Congress in the 1770s, Benjamin Franklin is at the back of the room waiting weeks on end before he stands up and he says, "I do not know whether the sun is rising or setting upon this republic." It begins in prayer. The Indian quest for independence, the 1930s, in the continent of India. Gandhi goes inwards in prayer in South African prisons and jails before he begins out on the streets of India. And so here's what I want to ask you in your life. What's been your soul journey this last year?